My first interaction with a crazy person went a little something like this. I was in the basement talking to some of my friends, discussing the possibility of getting a new mannequin to put in the house since the last one, well, I wouldn't want to spoil the ending. So we were talking about the idea of getting a female mannequin, which I already thought was crossing into weird territory. Then someone floated the idea of putting a dildo on the mannequin. I was strictly opposed to this idea, saying no, that would be far too weird. One of my friend's girlfriends asked why, and I replied, as a starter, that women don't have penises. She then looked at me more sternly and said something to the tune of, but women can have penises. I kept eye contact with her. For a moment, I couldn't really believe this conversation was actually happening. I replied, no, they can't. The room fell into silence after that. One of us had just said something completely absurd, and I was pretty sure it wasn't me. But no one was jumping in to join me in defending the obvious truth. Women have vaginas. They don't have penises. Case closed. Well, I thought so, but apparently this topic is up for debate. When I was growing up, I never really heard anyone talk about this seriously. I remember there being gay people in my middle school, but nothing really went past that. When I got to high school, things began to change. There were a lot more gay people. There was this one girl in a class of mine that identified as non-binary. She even wrote a whole speech about it, performed it for the school talent show, and everybody cheered at the end. There was another girl I knew from middle school, and I was friends with her my sophomore year of high school. I didn't really understand what a trans person was at the time, so I got into a bit of a disagreement with her. You see, she had cut her hair short, had a deeper voice, and had patchy facial hair. Essentially, what I was saying was, no, you're a girl. I remember you being a girl. She even went by the same feminine name. She kept saying that she was, in fact, a male. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand it. I knew that some people claimed things like that, but this girl was about as conservative as me and the rest of us in my friend group, so I just ended up being confused. I would have conversations with my friends in later years saying, you know this person, right? I knew them in middle school. She's a girl. They couldn't believe me, even when I used the right language. But to me, it was clear as day. I just couldn't stop seeing it. So what am I to believe now? I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, as well as watched dozens of videos on the subject over the years, which makes me think that I know a great deal about this issue. So here goes. I am about to channel the leftist within me to see if I understand everything that's going on here. So hold on, this might take a while, and I might say some things that you either agree with or disagree with. And I'm probably going to cut whatever I'm saying here short, because I'm just waiting for the teleprompter to get to the next paragraph. Gender as we know it isn't a binary. It's a spectrum. Gender isn't sex, which is represented by genitalia in biology. Rather, gender is the expression of the inward self. That being said, someone's gender identity can differ from what their sex says they appear to be. So as a result of this, a male can identify as a female, and a female can identify as a male. That's a pretty base level understanding though. Gender being a spectrum means that in between male and female, there is an unknowable number of different genders. So many that we can't quantify or name them all. This includes examples like non-binary, where the individual finds himself closer to the center of the spectrum, not identifying as a male or a female. This means that, essentially, since they don't identify with any specific gender, they also don't identify with traditional pronouns. He, she, his, hers. Instead, many of these non-binary or non-binary adjacent people prefer to be identified with the pronouns they and them. Likewise, since the spectrum is so broad, there are people who don't identify with these pronouns either, so they come up with their own. Some of the most prominent examples of these are the use of Z and Zer pronouns, which are typically used by gender-neutral or gender-fluid etc. individuals. Now, what's important to understand is that gender is a social construct. This essentially means that throughout much of history, women and men have been forced into arbitrary roles in society that could be fulfilled by either. This can be shown by various cultures throughout history which deviate from these traditional gender norms, in which women do things like hunting, while the men stay at home and take care of the children. This has also been shown in these communities by the acceptance of intersex individuals as third-gendered in some societies. The same concept of removing these specific gender roles started specifically in Western civilization when a couple of things happened. 1, when women got the right to vote. 2, when women entered the workforce. And 3, when women secured the right to use birth control and receive health care in the form of abortions. These, in conjunction, allowed women to break free from the traditional gender mold and allowed for men to do the same. This has led women to the realization that they have been oppressed for thousands of years. This is further expanded upon by the existence of intersectionality, in where the further you are away from the oppressor, the more you are oppressed, and the more you are affected and looked down upon in society through and negatively affected by things like sexism, internalized racism, microaggressions, and transphobia. For example, women have been, and still are on some level, oppressed. People of color have been oppressed as well. If these two intersect, meaning you are a black woman, then you are more oppressed than a white woman. If these intersect with other aspects, like being a trans woman, or a disabled person, or likewise, then the more oppressed you are. It is because things like this that we need to recognize our own sexism, internalized racism, and privilege so that we can act against it in order to treat the victims of intersectionality fairly. This could be done in the form of things such as affirmative action or diversity training in order to combat sexism, racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, classism, ageism, and religious discrimination. Now, I think that I've gotten a little bit off topic, so let's redirect back to the main discussion: trans people. Trans individuals have been in the news lately because a lot of transphobic Republicans have been claiming that trans people are forcing the indoctrination of children into being gay or trans, which is crazy because you can't indoctrinate someone into being gay or trans, along with the prominence of trans women competing in women's sports.
And tonight, female athletes are now taking a bold stand against biological men that compete in women's sports. One female cyclist, former Olympian, 3-time Olympian, is now calling on her fellow competitors to boycott races featuring trans women, saying they should take a knee at the starting line rather than compete. And former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines is also calling on female athletes to simply refuse to compete against trans women.
So Bud Light decides to hire Dylan Mulvaney as their brand ambassador for their beer. And it's funny because I'm seeing a lot of people say, like, you don't know who your customers are and all that. And people are arguing with me. Let me just state first and foremost, the stupidest thing I think Budweiser could do is hire someone like Dylan Mulvaney. I think Dylan Mulvaney is evil. I think Dylan Mulvaney is not trans. I think Dylan Mulvaney is a narcissistic sociopath who is pretending to be trans because it got them 10 million followers on social media.
If you want to know, go to the school. If it's not a book you're interested in, tell the teacher you don't want your kid reading it. But don't get in the way of my kid being able to read that book. That is not American. Get off my back.
That is not American. Okay, so before we get into Whoopi's confused philosophy, just as an historical point, banning books is very American. Banning drag shows is obviously very American. For much of American history throughout the country, including in San Francisco, transvestitism was completely illegal. You would be arrested for public disturbance if you ever did that. All sorts of weird sexual behaviors were illegal in the United States until the Supreme Court invented some right to do weird sex stuff in the mid-2000s, okay? So it is deeply, deeply American to proscribe this sort of weird behavior.
Now, trans children have been around for some time, mainly because people just don't wake up one day and decide that they are trans. This is something inherent to themselves that they have to identify, and many people can determine this from a very early age. Now, how young this is difficult to determine precisely, but what we do know is that discovering your gender expression isn't going to negatively affect you no matter your age. In fact, it's for the best if this happens early, since gender-affirming healthcare, such as puberty blockers, can be employed to hold off the child's natural puberty so that they can have time to determine what their gender expression is. This can be reversed at any time, but mainly, it assists in keeping trans women from developing male features that they don't want, and assists in keeping trans men from developing female features that they don't want. This makes transition easier and allows for the avoiding of body dysmorphia later in life, where the trans individual's body doesn't reflect the identity that they have within. Refusing to do so has the possibility of increased levels of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. This means that, in the long run, gender-affirming healthcare is better for the child, and everything should be done to encourage these children and their parents to allow for the child to choose who they are, rather than force them to align with the sex they were assigned at birth. Assigning a sex at birth is, in all honesty, not necessary, as we can't determine the expression of the child. Only they can make that determination. It is for these reasons that children should just be raised as gender neutral until they're able to make a determination as to who they are. And when that happens, the parent should do their best to affirm it. This task doesn't just fall into the parents though. Society should accept them for who they say they are as well. This means that we shouldn't assume the genders of people we meet, and we should do our best to use the correct pronouns of those we interact with. This also means that if someone identifies with a gender that they weren't assigned at birth, then they should be treated as the gender they identify with, as they didn't choose how they were born or how they identify. As a result, we can recognize trans women as women and trans men as men. For the sake of understanding, I've been using the terms trans men and trans women, but there are no real differences between trans women and women, and likewise, between trans men and men. So there shouldn't be distinction between the two. This should result in these individuals being accepted fully as who they identify themselves to be in every way. In the clothes that they wear, in the bathrooms they use, and in the sports teams they decide to compete in. Since there are no distinctions between trans women and women, giving no athletic advantage, the woman-identifying individuals should be allowed to compete against others who identify as women. Now, surgery isn't necessarily the solution for everyone, but it is a way to make a lot of people more comfortable with their own bodies. Gender-affirming healthcare, such as surgeries, can also be fairly expensive, so we can't look down upon people who haven't gotten surgeries or don't have body parts so that they match with what they identify as. As a result of this, we can say things like, not all women get periods, not all men have penises, not all women can get pregnant, men can menstruate, and yes, you could even say that women can have penises. Okay, I think I hit on just about everything, and I know that was a lot. There is a lot to go through, and I will try my best to touch on everything. What this rather long-winded explanation should tell you is that I've put a lot of thought into this, and I think I understand the position of trans people about as well as you can expect a 23-year-old to understand it. And that being said, with all that understanding, I still don't agree with the position. I don't think that trans women are women, and if you agree with everything that I just stated, then you would probably label me as a transphobic bigot just because I don't agree with you. But if you're willing to sit through me explaining how I interpret your side, and just about every talking point that I've ever heard get made relating to the matter, then maybe you can give me the same respect when I give my side. If you're scared to hear my side and you click off the video because you don't want to hear someone disagree with you, then I don't understand how you expect anyone to respect your viewpoint. If you're so right, then why don't you stick around and hear me out? There's nothing I can say that will damage you as an individual. I'm not dehumanizing you. I'm not trying to strip you of who you are. I think we're all valuable human beings, and I think that we can learn to discuss this matter with civility. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't been telling very many jokes in this video. I asked a friend about how I should go about discussing this matter and writing it, and their response was essentially that I should stay away from jokes and try to be as serious and sincere and respectful as possible. That then made me think, though, whose definition of respect should I operate with? You see, I'm trying to be respectful. I really am. And I think the most respectful thing I can do is to be as honest as I can be. I think we both know the truth. And I would be lying, not only to myself, but to you as well, if I called you by the wrong pronouns. The thing is, what the wrong pronouns are differs from person to person. I had a conversation with another friend about this same topic who stated that if you want to have a relationship with someone, if you want to have a conversation, you need to respect them. And in order to do that, you have to respect their pronouns. You have to respect who they identify themselves to be. From my side of things, I can see that you aren't who you're saying you are. You know who you really are. And it's the way you were born. You will never escape the truth of your biology. And if I decide to affirm your pronouns with who you present yourself as and claim to be, then I'm giving in to someone who has a problem by saying that their false identification of who they are is correct. If I want to be respectful and honest in the way that I interact with you, I can't do that and at the same time be respectful in the way that you think I should be. I have to be respectful in the only way that I know how. And that's by being entirely truthful. So first, let's talk about the idea of there being a gender spectrum. This is the idea that while there are two sexes and intersex people, gender is a construct created by social norms, passed down and strengthened generation to generation until it is all that we have ever known. The fact of the matter is, there is a difference between the two sexes, male and female, and those directly correlate to the traditional roles given to the genders because the genders go hand in hand with the sexes. Frankly, I use the words interchangeably because there are two sexes and two genders. And there is no reason to think that there is anything in between apart from people telling us that they don't fit the traditional gender norm. Men do have gender roles in society that correlate with their given sex. They are naturally stronger, which makes them better soldiers, better construction workers, and more capable at protecting people. While women, on the other hand, have the ability to produce and feed children. Now, this doesn't mean that one sex is better than the other. It just means that each has a station that they are better suited for. If you want to fight a war, you're not going to send all the women, you send the men. Men are more easily replaced because all men come from women. If you send all your women to die on the battlefield, then you can't survive as a civilization, which is why men have become, in the modern day, more likely to be the breadwinner, providing for the family, so that the women can care for the family. It's a symbiotic relationship. The man gets his feeling of importance by providing for the women and the kids, and the women get their feeling of importance by providing for the husband and the kids in their own way. What's important to note here is that traditional gender roles are codependent. One cannot thrive in the way that they were meant to be without the other. You could argue this point from a biological standpoint or an evolutionary standpoint. The outcome is the same. We can also conclude that one of these roles cannot be taken over by the other. A man can never bear children, nor can he feed it using his body. Only a woman can do that, and no amount of surgeries or hormone replacement therapy will ever change that fact of biology. Maybe the man has access to adoption or to baby formula, but in the way that humans were designed, they can never be the child's mother. The same goes for women. A woman, at least typically, cannot compete with males athletically. When I go on runs with a girl, she's usually got shorter legs. She can't match me if I decide to take off. And that is true for the average woman compared to the average man. A woman in a combat role will never be as effective as a well-trained man. And I'm not trying to be mean. That's just the truth of the biological differences between the two that create the gender roles that we know. So regardless of the identity of the man or the identity of the woman, one will never be able to become the other. So one thing that I can get partially on board with is the idea that gender is a spectrum, but it's probably not in the way that you're thinking. There is a range of men. Some are more effeminate than others, while some are more masculine than others. This exists in the same way that men vary in height, weight, muscle mass, and the amount of hair that you have on your face. Being a hyper effeminate man, however, does not make you into a woman. The same goes for women. You can have super girly girls and you can have tomboys, but the logic is the same. Gender isn't a spectrum, it's two spectrums, really. The problem is that the biological differences between the two means that there are two completely separate spectrums, not one that is continuous, where a man can become a woman and vice versa. So if you are someone that believes that you are on the other spectrum, or even somewhere in between the spectrums, biology doesn't agree. I'm not fully sure what to make of people that identify as non-binary and gender fluid people. They have just been misled into believing that if they reject traditional gender roles, then they can exist outside of the spectrum that they were born into. This is an issue in that no matter how hard you try to reject who you are, you will always be the person that you were born to be. So when you find acceptance being the person that you think you were born to be, and it is countered by your biology, then you have convinced yourself of a lie. And if you are lying to yourself, I can't in good conscience lie to you as well and affirm you being a third gender, because frankly, it doesn't exist. That's not me trying to threaten your existence as a person. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I respect you so much that I refuse to lie to you. Your existence has never been in question. If I thought you didn't exist, I wouldn't care so much about you and people like you enough to go through the trouble of talking to you like you're a genuine person. Now, a lot of the time, non-binary people are lumped together with intersex people, and these are two distinctly different cases. However, I will address intersex people here. People being intersex have been used and manipulated to be an explanation for a third gender, and that couldn't be further from the truth. To be frank, being intersex isn't a third gender. It's a genetic abnormality in the same way that conjoined twins and people born without legs might be considered. We know that human beings have 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 brain, and 1 heart. If you have less than or more than any of these, it doesn't make you not a human. It means that you're being affected by a genetic abnormality, or maybe you lost a leg or something. In the same way, if you have, say, a 3rd leg, you are not evidence that humans exist on a spectrum where some have less than 2 and some have more than 2. Rather, it is an indication that something has gone wrong in your development or along the way. The same is true with intersex people. Being intersex doesn't mean that you aren't human, but it also doesn't mean that you're evidence of a third gender. It means you're an abnormality. Intersex people can sometimes reproduce. Sometimes they can't. But if they can, it will always be with one of the 2 traditional methods. It won't be done in a third sexed or third gendered way. Sometimes people can't reproduce at all, be them men or women, due to a wide array of problems that could stem from just about anywhere. This is still a deviation from the norm, though. That's why we can say that males produce sperm or women can carry children, because it's what their bodies are designed to be capable of. If a woman can't carry children, it doesn't mean that she's not a woman. And it would be dishonest to say that some women can't carry children for any other reason than something going wrong along the way, or that woman becoming too old to bear children. A trans man is completely incapable of carrying children, not because something went wrong along the way, or because he's too old, but because he was never going to have the capacity to do so as a direct result of his biology. When it comes to the subject of intersectionality, we could talk about this for hours on end. But to be honest, it's really only tangentially connected to the conversation about trans people, so I don't want to go in depth into the subject. What I will say is that if you subscribe to the belief of intersectionality, It essentially means that your value as a person is not determined based on your merit. Suddenly, you are more valuable because you check more boxes. In reality, you shouldn't be hiring people or accepting them to colleges based on the idea that they have a specific race, gender, or sexual orientation. That couldn't be further from what makes you a valuable candidate. Now, I see the irony in being a straight white dude saying this, because I would be the person most negatively affected by something like this, but doesn't mean I'm wrong. We don't need to think too hard about the shoe being on the other foot, because according to intersectional feminism, it already has been. The concept is based around the idea that straight white men have been benefiting most in society due to them being straight, white, and males. And somehow, doing the exact same thing to us that we supposedly did to you in the past is going to right the wrongs of history. We should all know by now that two wrongs don't make a right. We didn't go around collecting every German citizen to kill them in concentration camps after we beat them in World War II. Really, we gave fair trials to the leadership and a lot of the people responsible for atrocities. Think about it this way. If I'm not promoted in a company because the company needs to meet a diversity hire quota, and someone with less experience who does a worse job is put above me just because they check more boxes, not only are they going to do a worse job than I would have done, but you're going to create the same kind of resentment in me that you are trying to avenge in yourself. I wouldn't look at the situation and think, I understand. This person really deserved the position because of the way my ancestor treated them in the past. I'd probably look at the situation more like, my family on my mom's side descends from farmers that immigrated to this country after the Civil War, so we never owned slaves. My family on my dad's side descends from a long line of pastors. Which one of my ancestors oppressed your ancestors for me to deserve this? The fact of the matter is that even if what intersectional feminists say is true, in that this system has benefited my white ancestors in ways that I'll never know, so the only way to solve for past discrimination is present discrimination, it's not gonna float well with a lot of people and will only result in more problems. Now, let's move on to the current debate. Firstly, let's talk about transphobia. Now, you can define transphobia in several ways, but the most concise definition is one that I found on Wikipedia. And while I was told not to use Wikipedia as a source, it certainly feels like the most complete definition. Transphobia is a collection of ideas and phenomena that encompass a range of negative attitudes, feelings, or actions towards transgender people or transness in general. Transphobia can include fear, aversion, hatred, violence, or anger towards people who do not conform to social or gender expectations. Now, I do believe that this is a definition many people would agree with, but I don't. From what I've said so far, I'm sure that I would be labeled as a transphobe, but I don't fear trans people. I don't try to avoid them. I don't hate them. I'm surely not using violence against them, although I have been told that misgendering them is violence, but then I disagree with your definition of violence too. And I don't feel anger towards them. I think a more accurate definition would simply be people who disagree with the trans movement, because I feel like transphobia has become an umbrella term for just that. People who disagree. I do think that this is dangerous, but effective. Since transphobia has been used in the same way as racist or xenophobe, being called transphobic has become something that more and more people have tried to avoid. So in order to do this, people just go along with it. Now, as I've said earlier, if you are a man who identifies as a woman, you still know the truth, and I still know the truth. But that doesn't mean that others don't know the truth too. Whenever someone looks at a trans person, their initial thought isn't, oh yeah, this is a normal person. 9 times out of 10, it is very recognizable what you actually are. The remaining 1 time out of 10 is when, in my personal experience, I look at someone and can't tell what they are, which means that they either still aren't passing for the other sex, or they are trying to look like something in between. In that case, you got me. Most time though, when I see a trans person, I know that something is at least a little bit off, and though many people may claim otherwise, humans have become very accustomed to spotting males and females as separate. so I'm not convinced. That being said, most of the time, a random person will immediately be able to tell what you biologically are, which means that they know that they're lying to themselves and to you when they call you by your preferred pronouns. They've just decided to go along with it because they, 1, convince themselves that it's normal, or 2, want to give the appearance that they support you so they don't get labeled as a transphobe. The most honest interaction that you'll likely receive is from someone like me, because I respect you enough to believe that you know the truth of your biology. This situation is partially different when you interact with a child. As far as a child knows, based on their upbringing, being trans could be something considered completely normal. Children have quite the active imagination. At various points growing up, I wanted to be Ben 10, the Avatar, not the blue people, the cool Avatar, and a Jedi. I was hoping for a Hogwarts letter well into age 13. These are fantasies, and I know that now. But I was also never told that my dreams were a reality. If my parents decided to indulge these dreams, then I would have been a very weird kid at school, and I can only imagine that this gets much worse for children who have parents affirming them identifying with the opposite gender. The solution for this is, of course, the use of puberty blockers. One of these puberty blockers is lupridide, which I don't know if I'm still pronouncing incorrectly, but this is a drug used for treating prostate cancer, problems with the uterus, and for chemical castration. These so-called reversible puberty blockers are primarily used to chemically castrate sexually violent males, and we are giving this to children.
Can you just reemphasize one of the points? Puberty just can't stop like it's a movie, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. It's a healthy process in the human body, and as you heard from Scott Nugent, that's a trans. A woman who transitioned to a male, although she says in the film, she's one of the only honest people we talk to, and she says, I transitioned to appear like a man, but I'll never be a man. Anyway, as we hear from her, that there are no studies that have been done on this whatsoever. We've never had a generation of kids that has had this done to them. Like, they're lab rats. So we're just kind of trying this out on a whole generation of kids. But based on what we do know, we know that these are serious drugs. A little bit later in that same interaction, we talk about what the actual drug is. The actual puberty-blocking drug is Lupron. That's what it's called. And it is used off-label to, quote, block puberty. It is actually a cancer drug for prostate cancer that you give to adult men. And at a certain point, they realized it had chemical castration properties, so they started giving it to sex offenders to chemically castrate pedophiles. And now we give it to 12-year-old boys. And I asked that pediatrician about that, said, Lupron, that's chemical castration. And that's when she said she wanted to get up and the interview was going to be over. She didn't want to talk about it, but it's absolutely true. And this is what we're doing, not just to a couple of kids, but to thousands, millions of kids.
And this isn't being done without research. No, we have researched this dating back to 2013. Granted, I doubt that this research was done on children, but we are certainly doing that now. The logic behind this is that these drugs were initially used to halt children from going into puberty too early, so they wouldn't be used for long periods of time, just until natural puberty should start. If you don't believe that these drugs chemically castrate people, then at least we should be able to agree that if these drugs do work the way that we're told they work, like if they just pause puberty and later that kid can decide to go through puberty naturally, then we must all agree that this child's sexual development will be stunted. If you go on puberty blockers from, say, 14 to 20, then wouldn't that mean that you'd be a stunted 20-year-old going through puberty for the first time? And this, sadly, is just the start of this topic. People are pushing to allow children to get gender-affirming healthcare without parents' permission, meaning that they could stunt your child's growth and castrate them without you knowing about it. Minors are getting these drugs and sometimes even surgeries, all before they turn 18. Surgeries are, granted, a little bit more rare, but hear me out. In the 3 years ending in 2021, at least 776 mastectomies were performed in the United States on patients ages 13 to 17 with a gender dysphoria diagnosis. Before they can vote, before they can drink alcohol, sometimes this happens before they can drive a car. That's just surgeries, not including the thousands that get the diagnosis, puberty blockers, or hormone replacement. This problem isn't just apparent in gender-affirming healthcare either. We have seen dozens of stories of graphic sex depicted in children's books, children being allowed or even encouraged to go, watch, and take part in lewd drag shows or attend drag queen story hour, where men dressed up as a sexualized woman reads a book to children.
Now, we have this clip from the Culture War podcast where I was having a conversation with Emma Vigeland of the Majority Report co-host. And considering what we saw with this Pride event, I want to play this clip and discuss it more in depth. So I'm going to play it for you now. Here we go. You're the one arguing for...
You're the one arguing for censorship.
Yes.
I mean, I don't really mind that stuff. I mean, are you in favor of children seeing violence on television?
No.
That scares me a little bit more.
It depends. It's not so simple to say violence, right? But yes, censorship is a good thing, but when done bad is a bad thing. There's a teacher who provided a book to her middle schoolers called This Book is Gay. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I have heard. That's actually a very good book.
And it provides instruction on children. She provided instruction to children on how to use adult gay anonymous sex apps. Yeah, I don't think that's appropriate. Now, look, by all means, you can be in favor of them.
Maybe she had a child. Maybe she had a child in her classroom who
wanted to go on Grindr and have sex with adults. Is that your argument?
No, I mean, I'm not saying that. First of all, I don't know. Again, this is
another. Why would a 10-year-old need Grindr?
This is the thing that you do, though, Tim.
Oh, that I do.
You're picking specific examples that are inflammatory.
You asked me for one.
Okay, then go ahead.
I did. We have the book.
Yeah, I'm
I said don't show children blowjobs.
Look,
you said you appreciate it.
I'm not in favor of censorship.
This Book is Gay is a book that teaches the individual reading it how to use adult sex apps. And holy crap, there are things described in that book that, look, I can't even describe.
I'm buying it.
I can't even, bro. We
gotta have it on the table.
Oh, you're buying the book. Yeah. Right. I don't disagree with that. I don't like giving these people money, but I think it's important to know and for people to read this stuff. But the book describes things that go well beyond sex and kink into what I would describe as dangerous behavior that can result in serious... look, when they talk about consuming feces, and it goes beyond that.
Wow.
They have it in front of kids. I have a friend who is gay, and when I'm talking to her about it, I'm like, look, like, you know me, like, I don't care about you and the people you love and you care about. You're one of my best friends. I want you to be happy. But you got to see this book. I mean, they're showing children these overt adult acts. And she said, no way. And I was like, let me show you the book because I have it. I show her the book and she goes, yeah, but there's no way that's in grade schools. And I'm like, let me pull up the story and show you that Ron DeSantis specifically was like, this should not. And when he tried to get it banned, they say he's banning books.
There is a reason why people are calling a lot of these activists groomers. They are trying to sexualize children from a young age. This is why so many people are getting mad about this issue. They brought the kids into it. It also affects kids who play sports. As I've already made clear, males have a distinct biological advantage over women when it comes to athletics. There is a reason why there's an NBA and a WNBA. There is no MNBA, a male's National Basketball Association. There are no rules against women competing in the NBA. The males just have a biological advantage over women so great that women have to have their own basketball league because they're not good enough to compete with the best of the best for the males. This is true in most sports, even high school sports. I remember hearing stories of women making football team as a kicker. I mean, that makes sense. Women have strong legs. In that field, they can compete with the guys. But you don't see any female linebackers. This wasn't a problem until men were allowed to get into women's sports by identifying as a female. Leah Thomas was not ranked highly with the men, in the low 400s at best. What happened when he started to identify as a female? Suddenly, he's good enough to beat the women. What this does is it puts women at disadvantages in sports, dissuading them from even participating. Women no longer have a place to compete. Now there's men's sports and there's trans men's sports. Trans women's sports. See, I'm already messing it up. See how confusing this is? Interesting that we don't see it the other way around. There's no great influx of trans men into men's sports. I wonder why that could be. If we don't let these men compete based on how they identify, if we don't let children get gender-affirming healthcare to treat their body dysmorphia, we hear all the time that these children will be depressed and commit suicide. And it's better that you have a trans daughter than a dead son. A Swedish study, which the Heritage Foundation dubbed the most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people, found the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers, 10 to 15 years post-op. But this science is hard to come by, and is often drowned out by claims that children will commit suicide if we don't let them transition. How can this be? If these people thought they identified a certain way, acted on it, then regretted it, then they're stuck in a mutilated body with non-functioning genitalia, with no chance of having their own kids for the rest of their life. This isn't something you're born with. It's something you're indoctrinated into believing it's okay, being by your parents, your peers, or social media. If people were born in the wrong body for as long as humans have been around, then we would see the same levels of depression and suicide rates consistent with this throughout all of human history. But we don't. If this was true, it would be consistent across all cultures. But it isn't. What's different? The difference is that the youth are being indoctrinated and led to believe that boys can become girls and girls can become boys. But it's not true. It's never been true. And it never will be. We used to tell our kids to be themselves, be who they are. But now, we're telling them that a fantasy can become a reality. Likewise, since the spectrum is so broad, there's people who don't identify with these pronouns either, so they decide to come up with their own. Some of the most prominent... I need to sound more leftist, so I can't say decide. It's inherent to themselves. They just have to discover it. I'm f***ing retarded. These, in conjunction, allowed women to break free from the traditional gender mold. For example, women have been, and still are on some level, oppressed. I say that way too happily. For example, women have been, and still are on some level, oppressed. People of color... Why do people say it like that? It is because of things like this that we need to reconsider our own sexism, internalized racism, and privilege so that we can act against it. I'm really trying here. Jeez, so many buzzwords. Trans individuals have been in the news lately because a lot of transphobic Republicans I sure wouldn't want to meet one of the transphobic Republicans. How young is difficult to determine precisely, but we do know that... Jeez, I sound like a pedophile. Oh my gosh. It's for the best if this happens early, since gender-affirming healthcare, such as puberty blockers, can be employed to hold off the child's natural puberty. Oh my gosh, these people are evil. For the sake of understanding, I've been using the terms trans women and trans men, but there are no real differences. I stuttered there. I stuttered. Then I am giving in to someone who has a problem. Damn right.